In 1994, a philosopher named David Chalmers stood before an audience in Tucson, Arizona, and divided the study of consciousness into two problems. One, he said, was easy. The other might be impossible. The easy problems were the ones science could, in principle, solve. How does the brain process information? How do we discriminate between different stimuli? How does neural activity produce speech, or guide behavior, or allow us to report what we are thinking? These are fantastically complex questions, but they are questions about mechanisms, about functions, about how things work. Give neuroscience enough time and funding and patience, and answers would come. But then there was the other problem, the hard problem. Why does any of this feel like anything at all? Why is there subjective experience accompanying the electrochemical dance of neurons? Why does the wavelength we call red not just trigger a certain pattern of firing in the visual cortex, but produce that private, vivid, unmistakable sensation of redness? Why does pain hurt? Why does joy feel joyful? Why is there something it is like to be you right now listening to these words? That question has fractured the entire field of philosophy of mind into camps that cannot quite speak the same language. Some insist the hard problem is the deepest question we can ask. Others insist it is a confusion, a trick of language, a category mistake that dissolves under careful analysis. And the remarkable thing is that both sides are populated by brilliant thinkers with rigorous arguments, and neither side has managed to convince the other of anything. This video will guide you through that question. We will walk through centuries of thought about consciousness, from René Descartes meditating by his fire in 1641 to David Chalmers standing in Tucson 3.5 centuries later, declaring that the thing you know most intimately might be forever beyond explanation. We will meet Thomas Nagel and his bat, Frank Jackson and his color scientist trapped in a black and white room, Daniel Dennett insisting the whole problem is an illusion. We will encounter philosophical zombies, inverted spectra, and the stubborn irreducibility of what philosophers call qualia, the raw feel of experience itself. And we will discover why, after decades of debate and the rise of sophisticated neuroscience and cognitive science and all the tools of modern philosophy, the hard problem remains exactly as hard as it ever was. The conference in Tucson was not some dusty academic affair conducted in obscurity. It was the first major interdisciplinary conference on consciousness, and it drew neuroscientists, psychologists, philosophers, and physicists together to finally tackle the problem of subjective experience. The optimism in the air was palpable. This was 1994, and the decade that followed would be declared the decade of the brain. Imaging technology was advancing. Neural correlates of consciousness were being mapped. Surely the thinking went, we were on the verge of cracking this ancient mystery. And then Chalmers got up and explained why we were not even close. He was 30 years old. He had a background in mathematics and cognitive science before turning to philosophy. He was not coming from the armchair tradition of pure conceptual analysis. He understood the science. He respected the progress. But he argued, with calm precision, that no matter how much we learned about the brain, we would never bridge the gap between physical processes and felt experience. You could catalogue every neuron, trace every pathway, measure every spike of activity, and still never explain why any of it was accompanied by the sensation of seeing blue or tasting coffee or feeling sad. The easy problems, he said, were easy because they were problems about objective function. When you ask how the brain discriminates between wavelengths of light, you are asking a question that can be answered in terms of mechanisms. You can point to cone cells in the retina, to processing in the visual cortex, to patterns of neural firing. You can build a model. You can test predictions. You can observe from the outside. But when you ask why seeing blue feels like something, you are asking a different kind of question entirely. You are asking about subjectivity itself. And subjectivity cannot be observed from the outside. It is the interior dimension of experience, the first-person perspective, the what-it-is likeness that seems to accompany certain kinds of information processing, but is not reducible to that processing. Chalmers called this the explanatory gap. Even if you had a complete physical description of a brain state, something would still be left out, the experience itself. Joseph Levine had introduced the term explanatory gap a decade earlier. But Chalmers sharpened it into a full-blown problem that could not be ignored. He was not claiming that consciousness was supernatural or non-physical in the sense of violating the laws of physics. He was claiming that our current conceptual framework for understanding the world in physical terms leaves consciousness out. We have no theory of how or why subjective experience arises from objective processes, and the reaction was immediate and divisive. Some philosophers nodded vigorously. This was exactly what they had been trying to say for years. Others recoiled. This was defeatism, mysticism disguised as argument. If consciousness was real, and the brain was real, then there had to be an explanation. The failure was not in the world but in our thinking. But here is what made the hard problem so sharp. You cannot deny that consciousness exists. You might doubt the existence of God, or the soul, or free will, or moral facts. But you cannot coherently doubt that you are having experiences right now. Descartes built his entire philosophy on this bedrock certainty. You can doubt everything else, but you cannot doubt that you are doubting, because doubting is itself a form of conscious experience. Consciousness is the one thing you know directly, immediately, without inference or argument. And yet, it is also the one thing that seems to slip through the net of scientific explanation. Science has given us extraordinary insight into the mechanisms of the brain. We can image activity in real time. We can correlate specific experiences with specific patterns of firing. We can even manipulate consciousness with drugs or electrical stimulation or lesions. But all of that is correlation and mechanism. None of it explains why there is experience at all. Chalmers was not the first to notice this, of course. The mind-body problem is as old as philosophy itself. Descartes had drawn a hard line between mental substance and physical substance, claiming they were fundamentally different kinds of things. That created its own notorious puzzle. How could an immaterial mind interact with a material body? How could a thought move an arm? Descartes never solved that problem, and his successors spent centuries trying to either answer it or dissolve it. By the 20th century, dualism had become deeply unfashionable. Most philosophers and scientists were committed to some form of physicalism, the view that everything is ultimately physical, that mental states are nothing over and above brain states, that consciousness must somehow be explainable in the same terms we use to explain digestion or respiration or any other biological process. This was not just a metaphysical preference. It was a commitment to the unity of science, to the idea that we live in one world governed by one set of laws, not a fractured reality of incompatible substances. But physicalism ran headlong into the hard problem. If consciousness is just brain activity, why does brain activity feel like anything? If pain is just C fibers firing, why does it hurt? You could reply that pain just is C fibers firing, that there is no gap to explain, that the feeling and the firing are identical, but that response felt like it was changing the subject. It was explaining away the very thing that needed explaining. And so the debate became entrenched. On one side, philosophers like Chalmers insisted that subjective experience was a further fact beyond the physical facts, something that could not be reduced or explained away. On the other side, philosophers like Daniel Dennett insisted that the hard problem was an illusion, a philosopher's invention, a conceptual knot tied by bad assumptions about what consciousness is. There was no ghost in the machine, no mysterious inner theatre, no ineffable quail of redness. There were just brains doing brain things, and the feeling of mystery came from misunderstanding what brains do. What makes this debate so striking is that both sides are arguing from the same evidence. They both know about neurons and synapses and neurotransmitters. They both accept evolution and the scientific method and the basic architecture of the brain, but they come to opposite conclusions about what remains to be explained. One side sees an unbridgeable gap, the other sees a mirage, and neither side has managed to close the argument. The hard problem, nearly 3 decades after Chalmers named it, is still hard. Consciousness is still the thing you cannot doubt and cannot explain. It is the condition of all your knowing, including your knowing of the problem itself. You are experiencing right now, in this moment, the very phenomenon that philosophy cannot account for. The mystery is not somewhere else. It is here in the fact that these words mean something to you, that you are aware of them, that there is something it is like to be you. The Tucson conference became an annual event. Thousands of papers have been published. Theories have proliferated. Neuroscience has mapped more and more of the brain's activity, and still no one knows why any of it feels like anything at all. To understand why this problem is so stubbornly resistant to solution, we must go back to the beginning, to the moment when a Frenchman sitting by a fire decided to doubt everything he thought he knew, and discovered that the one thing he could not doubt was his own thinking mind. In April of 1994, philosophers, neuroscientists, and psychologists gathered in Tucson, Arizona, for a conference with an ambitious title, Toward a Scientific Basis for Consciousness. The event took place at a moment of unusual optimism. Neuroscience had exploded in sophistication. Brain imaging technologies were revealing activation patterns that corresponded to specific mental tasks. Cognitive science had made consciousness, once considered too subjective for serious study, into a legitimate research program. The mood was collaborative, interdisciplinary, energized. And then David Chalmers, a young philosopher from Australia, gave a talk that divided the entire field in two. Chalmers proposed a distinction that seemed simple on its surface, but carried explosive implications. He argued that research on consciousness had been tackling what he called the easy problems. These were questions about the mechanisms underlying various cognitive functions, how the brain integrates information from different sensory channels, how it discriminates between stimuli, how it controls behavior, how it maintains states of wakefulness and sleep. These problems were called easy not because they were trivial. Some of them were fiendishly complicated. They were easy in a specific philosophical sense. They were the kinds of problems you could imagine solving, in principle, by figuring out the right mechanisms. You could see what a satisfactory answer would look like. It would involve identifying neural circuits, describing computational processes, showing how information flows from input to output. The explanatory structure was familiar. It was the structure of science itself. Then Chalmers pointed to something else, something that all those mechanistic explanations seemed to leave untouched. Why is any of this accompanied by experience? Why does processing visual information feel like something? Why does integrating sensory signals come with the qualitative texture of unified perception? Why is there something it is like to be you, right now, reading these words? This was the hard problem of consciousness. Not hard in the sense of requiring more research or better instruments, but hard in the sense that no amount of information about mechanisms seemed to touch it at all. Consider what Chalmers was claiming. You could, in principle, map every neuron in a human brain. You could trace every connection, record every firing pattern, understand every chemical transaction. You could build a complete functional account of how the brain responds to red light, which wavelengths strike the retina, how photoreceptors transduce electromagnetic energy into neural signals, how those signals propagate through the visual cortex, how they trigger associations and memories and language. You could explain all of that, and yet Chalmers insisted you would not have explained why any of this process is accompanied by the subjective sensation of redness. The experience itself, the qual, the felt quality, would remain unexplained. There would still be an explanatory gap between the physical story and the phenomenal fact. This was not a new worry. Philosophers had been troubled by the relationship between mind and matter for centuries. But Chalmers gave it a new formulation, a sharper edge. He made explicit what had been implicit in decades of debate, that there were really two completely different questions being asked under the umbrella of consciousness research. One question was about the performance of various cognitive functions. The other was about why performing those functions felt like anything at all. And the methods that worked for the first question did not seem to even address the second. The distinction landed like a provocation. Some researchers embraced it immediately. It gave a name to something they had already intuited, that explaining behavior and explaining experience were not the same project. Others rejected it with equal force. They saw the hard problem not as a deep insight but as a confusion, a relic of outdated thinking, a pseudo-problem generated by bad intuitions about what explanation required. The debate that followed was not polite. It became one of the most fractious disputes in contemporary philosophy. What made the division so stark was that it cut across usual alliances. You could not predict someone's position on the hard problem from their views on other philosophical questions. Materialists, who believed that everything in the universe was ultimately physical, split into camps. Some insisted that subjective experience was just another physical process, no more mysterious than digestion. Others admitted that physicalism might be true, but conceded that we had no idea how to explain consciousness in physical terms. Dualists, who believed mind and matter were fundamentally distinct, saw vindication. Functionalists, who defined mental states by their causal roles rather than their intrinsic properties, found themselves either dismissing the hard problem as irrelevant or struggling to accommodate it. The core of the disagreement was about explanation itself. What does it mean to explain something? When you explain how the heart pumps blood, you describe structures and mechanisms, valves, chambers, electrical signals, pressure gradients. The explanation works because you can see how the parts produce the outcome. There is no mystery left over, but when you describe how the visual cortex processes wavelength information, have you explained the redness of red? Chalmers said no. The subjective quality, the what it is like, remained untouched. His opponents said this was a trick of language, a false sense of mystery generated by confusing levels of description. They argued that once you explained all the functions, there was nothing left to explain. The feeling of mystery was just unfamiliarity with your own cognitive machinery. This was not a disagreement about facts. Both sides accepted the same neuroscience. They diverged on what counted as an adequate explanation. One side saw an unbridgeable gap between objective description and subjective reality. The other saw only the ghost of an old mistake, the lingering intuition that mind must be something more than the physical processes that produce it. And because the disagreement was about the very nature of explanation, it could not be resolved by gathering more data. No experiment could settle whether subjective experience was explicable in principle or fundamentally resistant to physical explanation. The debate was philosophical all the way down. Chalmers called the hard problem hard, but perhaps that understates the challenge. If he was right, then consciousness occupies a unique place in nature. Every other phenomenon, from the orbit of planets to the folding of proteins, yields to mechanistic explanation. You identify the relevant parts, describe their interactions, and show how the phenomenon emerges from those interactions. But consciousness on this view does not emerge from complexity. It is not a product of information processing or functional organization. It is something else, something that accompanies certain physical processes, but is not reducible to them. The physical facts do not necessitate the phenomenal facts. They leave room for a question: why this? Why experience? Why anything? The term Chalmers introduced in Tucson, the hard problem of consciousness, became standard vocabulary almost immediately. Within a few years, you could barely open a journal in philosophy of mind without encountering it. It structured debates, defined research programs, and forced everyone to declare a position. But declaring a position did not mean reaching agreement. Nearly 30 years later, the hard problem remains exactly what Chalmers said it was: hard. The field has not converged on a solution. It has splintered into increasingly sophisticated versions of incompatible views. What the hard problem reveals is not just a puzzle about consciousness, but a fault line running through our understanding of reality itself. If subjective experience cannot be explained in physical terms, then either our physics is incomplete, or our concept of explanation needs radical revision. If it can be explained physically, then why does it seem so persistently mysterious? Why does the gap between brain processes and felt experience refuse to close, even as neuroscience advances? These questions do not have easy answers. They might not have answers at all, but they point to something undeniable, that the thing you know most immediately, your own experience, is the thing that fits least comfortably into the scientific picture of the world. To understand why the hard problem is so hard, we must first understand how we arrived at the conviction that mind and body are separate things, a conviction so deep it shaped Western thought for centuries. In the winter of 1641, A French philosopher sat in a room heated by a single stove and decided to doubt everything. René Descartes had retreated from the noise of public life to think through a problem that had troubled him for years. How could anyone claim certain knowledge about anything when the senses so often deceive, when dreams feel real while we are in them, when even basic mathematics might be the trick of some malicious demon? He resolved to strip away every belief that could possibly be false, to find bedrock beneath the shifting ground of appearance. What he found was this: he could doubt the existence of his body, the reality of the external world, the truth of every proposition he had ever believed. But he could not doubt that he was doubting. The very act of thinking proved that something was doing the thinking. From this slender thread he pulled what would become the most famous sentence in Western philosophy: I think, therefore I am. Not, I have a body, therefore I am. Not, I perceive the world, therefore I am. The certainty was entirely inward, rooted not in matter but in mind. This was more than a clever logical move. It was the foundation of a metaphysical architecture that would shape centuries of thought. If the one undeniable truth is that thinking exists, and if the existence of thinking does not depend on the existence of anything physical, then thinking and physicality must be fundamentally different kinds of being. Descartes called them substances. Body was extended substance. It took up space, had shape and location, operated according to mechanical laws. Mind was thinking substance. It had no spatial properties, no weight or dimension, and its essence was consciousness itself. Two substances, utterly unlike, somehow inhabiting the same world. The implications were profound and immediate. If mind and body are distinct substances, then humans are composite beings, a material machine animated by an immaterial soul. The body operates by purely physical causes, grinding along like clockwork. The mind is free, rational, the seat of will and thought. Animals, lacking souls, are mere automata, complex, but ultimately mindless mechanisms. Only humans possess this strange dual citizenship, one foot in the realm of matter and one in the realm of spirit. The appeal of this view is not difficult to understand. It preserves human dignity and moral agency in the face of an increasingly mechanistic science. It explains the apparent gulf between physical processes and conscious experience. It makes sense of the intuition that your thoughts are not simply physical events in your skull, but something more intimate, more essentially you. Descartes gave philosophical form to what many people still feel, that the mind is somehow more than the brain, that consciousness cannot be reduced to neurons and chemistry. But dualism also created a problem so severe that it has haunted philosophy ever since. If mind and body are entirely different kinds of substance, how do they interact? When you decide to raise your arm, how does an immaterial thought cause a material limb to move? When you stub your toe, how does physical damage produce the non-physical sensation of pain? Descartes himself recognized the difficulty. He proposed that mind and body met in the pineal gland, a small structure deep in the brain, where somehow the immaterial and material could exchange signals. Even at the time, this seemed less like a solution and more like a gesture toward where the solution ought to be. The interaction problem became the central objection to dualism. Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, one of Descartes' sharpest correspondents, pressed him on exactly this point. If the mind has no extension, no location, no physical properties whatsoever, how can it push or pull or otherwise influence anything physical? Descartes had no satisfying answer. His followers would struggle with the question for generations, proposing increasingly elaborate theories. Occasionalism, which held that God intervenes at every moment to coordinate mind and body. Pre-established harmony, which suggested God wound up mind and body like synchronized clocks at the moment of creation. Each solution felt more desperate than the last. By the mid-20th century, dualism had become philosophically unfashionable. Most philosophers of mind were convinced that Descartes had made a fundamental error, though they disagreed about what exactly the error was. In 1949, Gilbert Ryle published a book called The Concept of Mind that attempted to diagnose the mistake with surgical precision. Ryle argued that Descartes had committed what he called a category mistake, treating the mind as if it were a thing of the same logical type as the body. only made of different stuff. His most famous illustration involved a visitor to Oxford being shown the colleges, the libraries, the laboratories, and then asking, "But where is the university?" The visitor has misunderstood what sort of thing a university is. It is not another building alongside the colleges, but the organization of all those buildings into a certain kind of institution. Similarly, Ryle argued, the mind is not a hidden entity inhabiting the body, but the organized pattern of dispositions, behaviors, and capacities that we attribute to intelligent beings. To talk about the mind is not to refer to a ghostly inner theatre, but to describe what a person is able to do. Ryle coined a phrase that has echoed through philosophy ever since: the ghost in the machine. Cartesian dualism, he argued, imagines a spectral homunculus sitting inside the mechanical body, pulling levers and observing screens, itself unobservable. This picture generates endless confusion, because it treats mental predicates as if they referred to hidden inner states rather than to publicly observable patterns. When we say someone is intelligent, we are not making a claim about some invisible mental substance, but about how they tend to act in various circumstances. The critique was devastating, or at least it should have been. Among professional philosophers, dualism became something of an embarrassment, the sort of view one might entertain as an undergraduate before learning better. The serious debates moved elsewhere, to behaviorism, to identity theory, to functionalism, and yet dualism never quite disappeared. It lingers in the background of nearly every conversation about consciousness, not because philosophers explicitly defend it, but because the intuitions that made it attractive in the first place remain forceful. Part of this persistence is cultural. Centuries of Cartesian influence have shaped how we talk and think about minds. We speak of mental versus physical, of the inner life versus outward behavior, of the real you hidden beneath the surface. Popular discourse still operates on largely dualist assumptions. The idea that your true self is your consciousness, that the body is a vehicle the mind inhabits, that identity persists independent of any particular physical form. But part of the persistence is philosophical. The problems that drove Descartes to dualism have not gone away. When you try to explain consciousness in purely physical terms, you run into the same stubborn gap between objective description and subjective experience. The hard problem that Chalmers would articulate 3.5 centuries after Descartes is in some sense a modern restatement of the interaction problem. How does the physical give rise to the experiential? How does matter become mind? Contemporary philosophers rarely defend substance dualism in its classical form, but property dualism, the view that mental properties are irreducible to physical properties, even if there is only one kind of substance, has proven far more resilient. The ghost may have been exorcised from the machine, but something ghostly remains in our theories of consciousness, an explanatory gap, a sense that the full story cannot be told in the language of physics alone. Descartes gave us more than a theory. He gave us a problem that refuses to be solved by simply rejecting his solution. The mind-body problem is not a confusion to be dissolved by better conceptual hygiene. It is a genuine puzzle about how two seemingly incompatible aspects of reality fit together. Ryle was right that treating the mind as a ghostly substance creates logical tangles, but acknowledging that the mind is not a thing does not make consciousness any easier to explain in physical terms. The obvious alternative to dualism is to insist that mind is nothing but matter, but this move, called physicalism, immediately confronts a challenge. If everything is physical, why does anything feel like anything at all? The most popular solution to the mind-body problem in contemporary philosophy is deceptively simple. Everything is physical. The brain is matter, thoughts are brain states, and consciousness is whatever the brain does when it generates subjective experience. This view, called physicalism, dominates academic philosophy of mind, not through some ideological consensus, but because it seems to be the only view compatible with what we know about the world. Science has spent 4 centuries explaining phenomena by reducing them to physical processes. Lightning became electrical discharge, heat became molecular motion, life became chemistry. Why should consciousness be different? The appeal of physicalism is undeniable. It promises unity. If mental states are physical states, then psychology can eventually merge with neuroscience, neuroscience with biology, biology with chemistry, chemistry with physics. One world, one kind of stuff, one set of laws, no mysterious substances, no ghostly minds floating free of causal order. Everything that happens, happens because physical things interact according to physical laws. The brain is 3 pounds of tissue, 100 billion neurons firing in patterns, chemicals crossing synapses, electricity cascading through networks. Somehow, all of this produces you, your memories, your intentions, your sense of self, the way music moves you and certain faces make you ache. All of it, the physicalist insists, is physical process. Nothing more, nothing less. This sounds reasonable until you try to apply it to a specific case. Consider pain. You stub your toe and signals race up nerve fibers to your spinal cord and into your brain. A particular pattern of neural activity occurs, involving regions like the somatosensory cortex, the anterior cingulate, the insula. Call this pattern C-fiber firing, the standard philosophical shorthand. The identity theorist, a particular type of physicalist, makes a bold claim: pain just is C-fiber firing. Not pain is caused by C-fiber firing. Not pain correlates with C-fiber firing. Pain is identical to C-fiber firing, in the same way that water is identical to Jesus, or heat is identical to molecular motion. This is what philosophers call type identity theory, proposed most forcefully in the 1950s and 60s by thinkers like U.T. Place and J.J.C. Smart. Their ambition was to make the mental scientifically tractable by showing it was nothing over and above the physical. Mental states are brain states. To study the mind is to study the brain. To explain consciousness is to explain neural activity. The theory had elegance and empirical grounding. Neuroscience was beginning to map mental functions to brain regions. Why not take the final step and declare the identity complete? But something resists. You can know every physical fact about C-fiber firing, the neurons involved, the chemical transmitters, the frequency of spikes, the pattern of activation across regions, and still seem to be missing what pain feels like: the throbbing, the urgency, the unpleasantness, that raw, immediate, awful quality of pain. No description of neural firing patterns seems to capture it. You can list every physical property of the brain state and still wonder, but why does this feel like something? Joseph Levine gave this puzzle a name in 1983, the explanatory gap. Even granting that mental states are identical to brain states, there remains a gap in our understanding. We cannot explain in physical terms why a particular brain state feels the way it does. We can explain why C-fibers fire when tissue is damaged. That is a causal story about receptors and signals and evolutionary function. We cannot explain why C-fiber firing is accompanied by this particular quality of experience. The explanation stops short. A gap opens between the physical story and the experiential reality. Levine did not claim this gap proves physicalism false. He claimed it shows something important about the limits of physical explanation. When we reduce heat to molecular motion, we understand why faster molecules produce the sensation of warmth. The reduction explains the phenomenon completely. When we reduce pain to C-fiber firing, we do not understand why this neural pattern produces the sensation of pain. The reduction leaves something unexplained. The gap persists. This is not ignorance that will be filled by future neuroscience. More detailed brain scans will not close it. Suppose we map every neuron, every synapse, every molecular interaction in the brain of someone experiencing pain. We would have complete physical knowledge. The explanatory gap suggests we would still lack knowledge of what the pain feels like from the inside. The first-person perspective seems irreducible to third-person description. Physicalists have offered various responses. Some argue the gap is merely epistemic, a limitation of human understanding rather than a feature of reality. We cannot imagine how brain states produce consciousness, but that does not mean they do not. Others suggest the gap will close once we understand the right physical properties, perhaps information integration or quantum coherence, or some yet undiscovered feature of neural dynamics. Still others, the more hardline physicalists, insist there is no gap at all, that the sense of mystery is a conceptual confusion we inherit from dualism. But the gap keeps reopening. Every attempt to explain consciousness in purely physical terms seems to leave out the one thing that matters most: what it is like. You can explain in principle how the brain discriminates stimuli, integrates information, controls behavior, stores memories. These are the easy problems. You cannot explain, even in principle, why any of this is accompanied by subjective experience. That is the hard problem, and physicalism, despite its dominance, has not solved it. The difficulty becomes especially acute when physicalists try to account for the qualitative character of experience, what philosophers call qualia, the redness of red, the bitterness of coffee, the particular way sadness feels in your chest. These qualities seem intrinsic to experience itself, not reducible to functional roles or causal relations. Yet physicalism seems to require that they be nothing but patterns of neural activity. The wine tastes the way it does because certain receptors are activated, certain signals are sent, certain brain regions respond. But this catalogue of physical events does not seem to capture the taste itself, the way it fills your mouth and lingers and connects to memories and moods. Some physicalists embrace eliminativism. Qualia, as traditionally conceived, do not exist. What we call qualia are really just dispositions to discriminate and respond. The redness of red is nothing over and above your ability to distinguish red from blue, to recognize red things, to react to red appropriately. This move saves physicalism by denying the phenomenon that made physicalism hard. It solves the problem by declaring it was never real. Others embrace reductive functionalism. Mental states are identical not to specific brain states but to functional states, defined by their causal roles. Pain is whatever state is caused by tissue damage, causes distress and motivates withdrawal. This pain could be realized in neurons, silicon, or some alien biology. The functional definition is multiply realizable. This view has power and flexibility, but it inherits the same gap. Knowing the causal role of pain does not explain why occupying that role feels like anything at all. The physicalist project has not failed. It has produced tremendous insight into the neural basis of cognition, perception, memory, emotion. It has unified our understanding of the mind with our understanding of biology. It has made consciousness an object of scientific study rather than metaphysical speculation. But it has not explained, in a way that satisfies, why the brain's activity is accompanied by subjective experience. The explanatory gap remains, and with it, the hard problem. One way to sharpen the puzzle is to imagine creatures physically identical to us in every way, except they have no inner life at all. These are the philosophical zombies, and their conceivability raises troubling questions. Imagine a creature that walks beside you, talks with the same inflection you use, laughs at the same jokes, recoils from the same injuries. This creature processes information about wavelengths and registers them as colors. It withdraws its hand from flame. It reports feeling sad when it hears minor chords. By every measure available to an observer, this creature is conscious, but inside there is nothing, no redness of red, no sting of fire, no melancholy wash of music. The creature is a perfect replica of a human being in every physical and functional respect, yet utterly devoid of subjective experience. Philosophers call this hypothetical being a zombie, and its mere conceivability has fractured the philosophy of mind. The philosophical zombie is not the shuffling undead of horror films. It is something far more unsettling, a thought experiment designed to test whether consciousness can be fully explained by physical facts. David Chalmers, building on earlier work by philosophers like Robert Kirk and Todd Moody, placed the zombie argument at the center of his case against physicalism in the mid-1990s. The logic runs like this. If you can coherently imagine a world physically identical to ours in every detail, down to the last quark and synapse, but where nobody is conscious, then consciousness cannot be merely a physical property. If such a world is even conceivable, then there must be something about consciousness that goes beyond the physical structure of the brain. The zombie argument works by prying apart two concepts that physicalists want to keep fused: physical organization and subjective experience. A zombie has all the physical properties. Its neurons fire in exactly the same patterns as yours. Its brain produces the same outputs in response to the same inputs. It says, "I am conscious" when asked, because the physical mechanisms that generate speech are intact. But when the zombie looks at a red rose, there is no phenomenal redness. When it bites into lemon, there is no sour taste. The lights are on, the machinery hums, but nobody is home. Chalmers argues that the conceivability of zombies reveals an explanatory gap that cannot be closed by any amount of physical information. You can specify every neural connection, every neurotransmitter concentration, every pattern of electrical activity, and you will still not have explained why any of this is accompanied by experience. The zombie has all the physical facts. What it lacks is consciousness itself. Therefore, consciousness must be something additional, something that does not automatically follow from physical structure alone. This conclusion strikes many physicalists as deeply wrong, even absurd. The counterattack focuses on the relationship between conceivability and possibility. Just because you can imagine something does not mean it could actually exist. You can conceive of water that is not made of hydrogen and oxygen, at least in the sense that you can form the words and think you understand them. But once you know what water really is, you realize such a thing is metaphysically impossible. Water just is Heithol. Perhaps consciousness just is certain physical processes, and zombies, while verbally conceivable, are actually impossible, in the same way non-Heithol water is impossible. The philosopher Daniel Dennett takes this line further, arguing that zombies are not genuinely conceivable at all. If you truly imagined a being with all the physical and functional properties of a conscious creature, you would have imagined a conscious creature. The very idea that you could have all the mechanisms of consciousness without consciousness is incoherent, a conceptual sleight of hand. When you think you are imagining a zombie, you are actually just imagining a person, and then verbally stipulating that they lack consciousness without really imagining what that would mean. This dispute has calcified into one of the most entrenched standoffs in contemporary philosophy. Those who find zombies conceivable tend to think the hard problem is genuine and probably unsolvable by physicalist means. Those who find zombies inconceivable tend to think the hard problem rests on a confusion about the nature of consciousness or the limits of imagination. Neither side has managed to persuade the other, in part because the disagreement occurs at such a fundamental level. It is not about evidence or data, it is about what counts as a coherent thought. The zombie debate matters because it crystallizes the central question of the hard problem: is consciousness a further fact beyond the physical, or is it simply what certain physical systems do? If zombies are possible, even in principle, then physicalism is false. Consciousness would have to be something added to physical structure, something that could in principle be absent even when all the physical facts are present. This would vindicate some form of dualism, or at least non-physicalism. If zombies are impossible, then consciousness must be entailed by physical structure in a way we do not yet understand, and the task is to explain how. What makes the zombie scenario so philosophically potent is that it forces clarity about what we mean by explanation. When a physicist explains water, she shows how its properties follow necessarily from the arrangement of hydrogen and oxygen atoms. When a biologist explains reproduction, she shows how organisms copy their genetic material through chemical processes. These explanations work because the phenomena are functional, structural, relational, but consciousness seems different. Even if you knew every relational and functional fact about a brain, it seems you could still sensibly ask, but why is this accompanied by experience? The zombie scenario gives that lingering question concrete form. Critics note that our intuitions about what is conceivable are notoriously unreliable, especially when dealing with phenomena as complex as consciousness. We evolved to navigate a world of medium-sized objects and social interactions, not to intuit the deep nature of mind and matter. Perhaps our sense that zombies are conceivable reflects only the limits of our imagination, not the structure of reality. Perhaps consciousness is so tightly woven into certain physical configurations that separating them, even in thought, is ultimately incoherent despite our sense that we can do it. Yet the zombie argument persists because it captures something that feels undeniable to many people: the sense that consciousness has an interior dimension that eludes third-person description. You can catalogue every neural event, but the redness you see when you look at a rose seems like a further fact, something that the neural catalogue does not contain. The zombie scenario sharpens this intuition into an argument. If you can subtract the experience and leave the physical structure intact, then the experience was never just physical structure to begin with. The deeper issue beneath the zombie debate is whether consciousness is the kind of thing that can be explained at all in the way we explain other natural phenomena. If it can, then zombies must be impossible, and our sense that we can conceive them must be illusory. If it cannot, then consciousness stands outside the ordinary order of nature, and we face the unsettling prospect that the one thing we know most intimately is also the one thing that forever resists full scientific understanding. The zombies stand at the gates, not as creatures to be feared, but as thought experiments testing the boundaries of explanation itself. If zombies point to the limits of third-person explanation, another thought experiment takes us inside a first-person perspective radically unlike our own, the experience of a bat. In 1974, a philosopher named Thomas Nagel published a paper in the Philosophical Review that would become one of the most widely read and cited essays in the philosophy of mind. Its title was a question, "What is it like to be a bat?" The question was not rhetorical. Nagel was asking, with genuine philosophical precision, whether there existed any method by which we could cross the chasm between objective description and subjective experience. His answer, delivered across 15 pages of measured prose, was no, and the implications of that answer are still reverberating. Nagel began with an observation that seems almost innocuous until you sit with it. Consciousness, he noted, is what makes the mind-body problem truly difficult. Without it, we would face merely technical puzzles about how brains coordinate behavior, process information, respond to stimuli. Challenging problems, certainly, but not fundamentally mysterious ones. Consciousness transforms the question entirely, because consciousness means that there is something it is like to be a particular organism. There is something it is like to be you, reading these words. There is something it is like to be a bat, navigating a dark cave by sound. And this subjective character of experience, Nagel argued, cannot be captured by any objective account, no matter how complete. He chose bats deliberately, not because they are alien to us in every respect. They are mammals, after all, with brains not entirely unlike our own, but because their primary sensory experience is so thoroughly different from ours that we cannot reconstruct it from the inside. Bats perceive the world through echolocation. They emit high-frequency sounds and interpret the returning echoes to build a sonic map of their surroundings. They detect distance, texture, motion, the hollowness of trees, the flutter of moth wings. This is not merely hearing in the way we hear. It is a perceptual modality we do not possess and cannot genuinely imagine. You can learn all the physics of echolocation. You can study the bat's auditory cortex, map its neural pathways, measure the timing and frequency of its calls, track the processing of returning signals with exquisite precision. You can become the world's foremost expert on the neuroscience of bat perception. But none of this, Nagel insisted, would tell you what it is like to experience the world through echolocation. You might simulate it in crude approximations. You might imagine clicking your tongue in a dark room and listening for echoes, feeling your way through space by sound alone. But this is not what it is like to be a bat. This is what it is like for a human to pretend to be a bat. The actual experience, the subjective texture of echolocating flight, the particular quality of spatial awareness it affords, the way distance and texture and motion feel from that perspective, remains opaque to you. This is not a practical limitation. It is not that we lack the right instruments or the right vocabulary. It is a conceptual barrier. The subjective character of experience is essentially tied to a particular point of view. To know what it is like to be a bat, you would have to be a bat. To adopt the bat's perspective, you would have to abandon your own. And what you would then know would be available only to you in that moment, from that vantage. It could not be translated back into objective terms and conveyed to others. Nagel was not arguing for mysticism. He was not claiming that consciousness is supernatural or beyond the reach of scientific investigation. He was making a point about the structure of our concepts, Science proceeds by moving from subjective appearances to objective descriptions. We observe phenomena from many perspectives, abstract away the idiosyncrasies of individual viewpoints, and arrive at accounts that are maximally independent of any particular observer. This is science's great strength. It is how we discover universal laws, build reliable theories, achieve consensus. But consciousness, by its very nature, is what remains when you subtract the objective description. It is the perspective you cannot step outside. And so Nagel concluded, a purely objective science might describe all the facts about a bat's brain and behavior without ever touching the fact that there is something it is like to be that bat. The argument landed with peculiar force. Part of its power came from its simplicity. Nagel did not rely on exotic thought experiments or complex logical machinery. He asked you to consider a real animal with a real sensory system and to notice how your knowledge ran out. Another part came from its timing. By the 1970s, many philosophers had convinced themselves that physicalism was all but proven, that the mind-body problem was on its way to being solved by identifying mental states with brain states. Nagel's paper reminded them that something essential was being left out, not because the identification was wrong necessarily, but because no identification of that kind could capture the intrinsic character of experience. He introduced a term that would become central to later debates: the subjective point of view. Every conscious organism, Nagel suggested, occupies a particular perspective on the world. That perspective is not merely the location from which the organism perceives. It is the character of perception itself, the specific way things seem to that organism. For a bat, the world appears in ways structured by echolocation. For you, it appears in ways structured by vision, by color and shape and depth. These are not just different data streams feeding into the same underlying consciousness. They are different ways of being conscious, different modes of experiencing reality, and each mode has a phenomenal character that cannot be fully communicated to a being who does not share it. The irreducibility of the subjective point of view poses a profound challenge to the scientific worldview. Science seeks explanations that abstract away from perspective. It aims to describe the world as it is, independent of how it appears to any particular observer. But if consciousness is essentially perspectival, then any attempt to give a complete objective account of it will necessarily omit the very feature we are trying to explain. We will have explained the mechanisms of perception, the flow of information, the neural correlates of awareness, but we will not have explained what it is like. And that, Nagel argued, is not a gap we can close by gathering more data. It is a conceptual mismatch between the nature of consciousness and the tools we use to understand it. Some philosophers responded by accusing Nagel of setting an impossible standard. If the only way to know what it is like to be a bat is to be a bat, then of course science cannot deliver that knowledge. But science was never supposed to deliver the experience itself, only an explanation of it. Nagel's reply was subtle but devastating. He was not demanding that scientists make us into bats. He was pointing out that even a complete explanation of the bat's neurobiology would not bridge the gap between physical description and phenomenal experience. The explanation would tell us everything about how the bat's brain processes echolocation signals. It would not tell us what those signals feel like from the inside, and if explanation leaves that out, then something about consciousness resists explanation. Others tried to soften the conclusion. Perhaps we cannot imagine bat experience because our imaginative capacities are limited, not because bat experience is inherently inaccessible. Perhaps future neuroscience will develop new concepts that allow us to grasp phenomenal character in objective terms. Nagel did not rule out these possibilities, but he noted that no one had the faintest idea how such concepts might work, and until someone showed how to bridge the gap between physical processes and phenomenal qualities, the problem remained unsolved. The influence of Nagel's paper spread far beyond academic philosophy. It shaped debates in neuroscience, psychology, artificial intelligence. It became a touchstone for anyone trying to articulate why consciousness feels different from other scientific problems. David Chalmers would later cite it as a direct inspiration for the hard problem. Daniel Dennett would spend considerable effort arguing against it. Frank Jackson would build on its insights to construct his own thought experiment. The bat became a symbol, a shorthand for the irreducibility of experience. What makes Nagel's argument endure is not just its logical force, but its existential resonance. We are all, in a sense, bats to each other. You do not know what it is like to be anyone but yourself. You can infer, empathize, imagine, but the actual texture of another person's joy or grief or boredom remains hidden behind the wall of their subjectivity. And if we cannot fully know what it is like to be each other, despite sharing the same species and sensory modalities, what hope is there for objective science to capture the essence of experience? Nagel's bat is a reminder that the world contains perspectives we cannot occupy, experiences we cannot share, and that this limitation is not accidental but woven into the nature of consciousness itself. Another way to illustrate the gap between knowing about the brain and knowing experience is to imagine a scientist who knows everything about color vision but has never seen color herself. In 1982, Frank Jackson introduced a thought experiment that would become one of the most debated arguments in philosophy of mind. He asked his readers to imagine a woman named Mary, a brilliant neuroscientist who has spent her entire life confined to a black and white room. From birth, she has never experienced color. Everything she sees is rendered in shades of gray. Her books are printed in black ink on white paper. Her clothes, her furniture, the walls around her, all exist in a world drained of chromatic information. But Mary is no ordinary prisoner of circumstance. She is the world's leading expert on the neurophysiology of color vision. Through her monochrome monitors and grayscale textbooks, she has mastered every physical fact about what happens when light of different wavelengths strikes the retina. She knows precisely which combinations of cone cells fire when someone looks at a ripe tomato. She can describe the exact neural pathways that carry signals from the eye to the visual cortex. She understands the computational processes that allow the brain to distinguish scarlet from crimson, azure from navy. She has complete knowledge. Jackson insists on this word, complete physical knowledge of color vision. There is no fact about the physics of light, the biology of eyes, or the neuroscience of visual processing that Mary does not know. Then one day, Mary is released from her black and white room. She steps outside and sees a red rose for the first time. The question Jackson poses is deceptively simple. Does Mary learn anything new? Your immediate intuition probably says yes. Of course she learns something. She learns what red looks like. She discovers the actual experience of redness, not the wavelength, not the neural correlates, but the subjective quality itself. Before, she knew about red. Now she knows red. And that knowing seems to be a different kind of knowledge altogether. If you share this intuition, Jackson argued, you must accept a profound consequence. Mary had complete physical knowledge before leaving the room. If she learns something new upon seeing red, then what she learns cannot be a physical fact. It must be something over and above the physical facts. Therefore, physicalism is false. There are facts about consciousness, facts about what experiences are like, that cannot be captured by even complete physical descriptions of the brain. Jackson called this the knowledge argument. It became an immediate philosophical sensation, in part because it seemed to capture something obvious about consciousness that physicalist theories kept trying to explain away. The argument did not rely on exotic metaphysics or questionable assumptions about causation. It simply pointed to the apparent gap between knowing all the physical facts about an experience and having that experience yourself. The structure of the argument is elegant. Mary's situation establishes the premise complete physical knowledge without experiential knowledge. The moment of release provides the test case. If she gains new knowledge, if there is a fact about redness she could not know before, then physical facts do not exhaust all facts. The conclusion follows by simple logic. Either Mary learns nothing new, which violates our strong intuition, or she learns something which violates physicalism. Defenders of physicalism immediately mounted counterattacks. Some argued that Mary does not learn a new fact at all. She simply gains a new ability, the ability to recognize, imagine, and remember red things. This ability hypothesis suggests that the difference between knowing about red and experiencing red is not a matter of propositional knowledge, but of practical skill. Mary before release is like someone who has read every book about swimming but never entered water. When she finally swims, she gains a new capacity, not a new fact about what swimming is. Others suggested that Mary does learn a new fact, but it is still a physical fact, just presented in a new way. This is the phenomenal concept strategy. The idea is that Mary already knew the physical fact that constitutes the experience of red. She knew the brain state involved. What she lacked was the phenomenal concept of redness, the particular way that experience presents itself to the person having it. When she sees red, she acquires a new concept for something she already knew under a different description. Just as the ancient astronomers knew that the morning star was identical to the evening star without initially realizing they were the same planet Venus, Mary knows the physical reality of red experience without initially grasping it under its phenomenal mode of presentation. These replies are ingenious, but they feel like elaborate attempts to deny what seems obvious. When Mary sees red for the first time, something happens that all her neuroscience could not prepare her for. The quale of redness, the specific way red feels from the inside, appears to be something distinct from any amount of information about neural firing patterns. What makes the Mary case particularly powerful is its personal accessibility. You do not need to understand philosophy of mind to grasp the thought experiment. Anyone who has tried to describe a taste to someone who has never tried that food, or explain a piece of music to someone who has not heard it, recognizes the gap between description and experience. Mary's predicament is simply a purified, extreme version of something familiar. Knowledge about is not the same as knowledge by acquaintance. Jackson himself remained convinced by his own argument for over a decade. He wielded Mary against physicalism in papers and debates throughout the 1980s and early 90s. The knowledge argument became one of the standard objections to materialist theories of mind, cited alongside Nagel's bat and Chalmers' zombie, as evidence that consciousness outruns physical explanation. Then, in 1998, Jackson published a paper titled Postscript on Qualia, in which he repudiated his own argument. He announced that he now accepted physicalism and believed the knowledge argument could be answered. His reversal was not based on new empirical evidence, but on a change in his assessment of the philosophical moves available to physicalists. He came to think that the phenomenal concept strategy could work, that Mary's new knowledge was indeed knowledge of an old fact under a new guise. The philosophical community reacted with fascination and some bewilderment. It is unusual for a philosopher to abandon the argument that made their reputation. Some saw Jackson's reversal as honest intellectual evolution. Others suspected he had simply grown tired of defending a position under constant siege. Still others argued that his original intuition was correct, and that his later capitulation to physicalism was motivated by a desire for theoretical unity, rather than by genuine philosophical insight. But Jackson's change of mind did not settle the debate. If anything, it intensified the controversy. Those who never accepted the knowledge argument saw his reversal as vindication. Those who found the argument compelling saw it as a cautionary tale about the seductive pull of physicalism in contemporary philosophy, a pull so strong that even the creator of one of its most effective challenges eventually succumbed. The deeper issue is what exactly Mary's case reveals about the structure of knowledge and explanation. Does it show that consciousness involves non-physical facts? Or does it show that some facts can only be grasped through certain kinds of access? The difference matters. If there are genuinely non-physical facts about experience, physicalism is false, and we must rethink our entire picture of how mind relates to matter. If instead the same physical facts can be known in different ways, some descriptive, some experiential, then physicalism might survive. But we must acknowledge that third-person scientific knowledge cannot capture everything about what it is like to be conscious. Mary sits at the intersection of epistemology and metaphysics, of what we can know and what exists. Her imagined life in grayscale and dramatic release into color continues to provoke arguments decades after Jackson first described her. She has been invoked in thousands of papers, reimagined in countless variations, and remains one of philosophy's most vivid thought experiments. The reason she endures is that she isolates a single question with perfect clarity. When you strip away all the physical information and then reintroduce the experience itself, Does something remain to be explained? Your answer determines not just your view of consciousness, but your entire conception of what sort of world we inhabit. These thought experiments all point to the same mysterious feature, qualia, the raw feel of experience. But what exactly are qualia? And can they be fit into a physical world? These thought experiments all point towards something philosophers have tried to name, tried to define, tried in some cases to explain away. The term itself sounds technical, almost medicinal, qualia. The singular is qual, from the Latin for quality or property, but what it refers to is immediate, undeniable, and utterly familiar. Qualia are the what it is like of experience. The redness you see when you look at a rose, the sharp sting of touching ice, the way coffee tastes on a winter morning, bitter and warm, and somehow comforting in a way that no chemical analysis of flavor compounds can quite capture. Qualia are not the objects themselves, not the light wavelengths or the neural firings or the molecular structures. They are how those things feel from the inside. You know what qualia are because you have them constantly. Right now, wherever you are listening to this, you are having experiences with a particular texture, the quality of the darkness behind your eyelids if they are closed, the sensation of weight where your head meets the pillow, perhaps the lingering taste of toothpaste or the ambient hum of a fan, or the cool touch of sheets against your skin. Each of these has a distinctive character, a felt quality that seems as real as anything in the world, more real in fact, because qualia are your direct access to reality. Everything else you know about the world comes filtered through them, and yet qualia present a deep puzzle. They seem to have 4 characteristics that make them philosophically troublesome. First, they are private. No one else can feel your pain, see your red, taste your coffee. You might describe these experiences, but the description is not the thing itself. Second, they are ineffable, difficult, or perhaps impossible to fully convey in words. How would you explain the redness of red to someone who had never seen color? You might say it is warm, bold, attention-grabbing, but these are associations, not the quality itself. Third, qualia are intrinsic. The redness of your experience is not about anything else, not defined by its relations or its causes or its effects. It simply is what it is. Fourth, they are immediately or directly apprehended. You do not infer that you are in pain. You do not deduce that you are seeing red. You know these things with absolute certainty, prior to any reasoning. These 4 features, privacy, ineffability, intrinsicness, and immediate apprehension, qualia resistant to the usual tools of scientific explanation. Science excels at describing structures, patterns, causal relationships, functional roles, but qualia seem to be none of those things. They are not structures but experiences. They are not patterns but individual instances. They are not defined by what they do but by what they are. This is why qualia have become central to the hard problem. If you could fully explain consciousness in terms of brain processes, information flow, and computational states, you would still face the question, why does any of this feel like something? Why is there a subjective quality to seeing red rather than simply a functional response to certain wavelengths? The explanatory gap opens widest here, at the edge of the qualitative. But not everyone agrees that qualia pose a genuine problem. Daniel Dennett, perhaps the most prominent skeptic of the hard problem, has spent decades arguing that qualia, as traditionally conceived, do not exist. His position is not that we lack experiences, that would be absurd, but that the philosophical notion of qualia, with its 4 troublesome features, is incoherent. In his view, qualia are not a real phenomenon awaiting explanation, but a conceptual confusion that needs to be dissolved. Dennett's strategy is to show that what we call qualia are actually dispositions, reactions, functional states that can be fully explained in physical and computational terms. When you say you are experiencing red, you are not referring to some private, ineffable, intrinsic quality. You are reporting on a complex set of processes, discrimination capacities, memory associations, verbal dispositions, comparisons with past experiences. These processes are entirely physical, entirely explainable. The illusion that there is something more, some extra quail floating above the mechanisms, arises from a kind of philosophical sleight of hand, a mistake about what experiences really are. In his work, Dennett asks us to consider what would actually be left if you stripped away all the functional, relational, comparative aspects of an experience. What would a pure quail be, divorced from everything it does, everything it connects to, everything you can say or think about it? His answer: nothing coherent. The idea collapses under scrutiny. What we call the redness of red is not a mysterious extra ingredient, but the whole pattern of responses, recognitions, and reactions that redness triggers in a functioning brain. This is a radical claim, and it has not convinced most philosophers who worry about consciousness. But Dennett's critique forces a clarification. What exactly are we pointing to when we talk about qualia? Are we talking about real features of the world, or are we talking about the way we talk about features of the world? One way to test whether qualia are real, separate from their functional roles, is to imagine a scenario called the inverted spectrum. Suppose that from birth, your color experiences were systematically different from mine. When you look at a ripe tomato, you have the experience I have when I look at grass. When you look at the sky, you have the experience I have when I look at a tangerine. But because your internal spectrum is inverted consistently, you learn to call the tomato red and the sky blue, just as I did. You use color words correctly, sort objects by color perfectly, navigate the world without any difficulty. From the outside, we are functionally identical. The question is, would we ever know? Could there be a fact of the matter about whether your red is my green? If qualia are private and intrinsic, then yes, there is a real difference, even though no test could ever detect it. But if Dennett is right, and qualia are just functional states, then the inverted spectrum is not genuinely conceivable. If everything about our responses, dispositions, and discriminations is the same, then our experiences simply are the same. There is no extra qual left over to be inverted. The inverted spectrum has been debated since John Locke raised the possibility in the 17th century. It remains unresolved because it presses on exactly the issue that divides philosophers of mind: whether experience has an intrinsic character beyond its functional role. Those who believe in qualia say yes. Those who follow Dennett say no. The stakes are higher than they might initially appear. If qualia are real, then physicalism faces a deep challenge. How can a purely physical system generate private, ineffable, intrinsic qualities? If qualia are illusory or misconceived, then the hard problem dissolves. Consciousness becomes just another biological phenomenon, complex and fascinating, but not metaphysically mysterious. Dennett himself sometimes describes his project as a form of philosophical therapy. We feel that there is a mystery because we have inherited bad concepts, confused categories. The job is not to solve the mystery, but to show that it was never really there. Consciousness does not need explaining in the sense that the hard problem suggests. What needs explaining are the mechanisms of perception, memory, attention, and self-monitoring, all of which are tractable, all of which science is steadily illuminating. And yet, for many philosophers, Dennett's position feels like a kind of avoidance. To say that qualia are illusions is not to explain them, but to explain them away. It is to deny the very phenomenon that seemed most undeniable, the felt quality of experience itself. When you bite into a lemon and your face puckles at the sourness, when you see a sunset and feel a wash of orange and gold across your vision, when you stub your toe and the sharp, bright pain floods your awareness, are you really just experiencing a set of functional dispositions? Or is there something it is like, something that goes beyond the mechanisms? This is not a question that can be settled by introspection alone, because introspection is itself part of what is in dispute. Dennett would say that when you introspect, you are simply accessing more functional states, more reports from internal monitoring systems. Those who defend qualia would say that introspection reveals something irreducibly subjective, something no third-person account can capture. What makes qualia matter, in the end, is that they are what make consciousness hard to explain. If experiences were just information processing, just patterns of neural activity, the hard problem would not arise. We could point to the brain and say, there it is, that is consciousness. But because experiences have this qualitative dimension, this felt character, We are left with the question, why should information processing feel like anything at all? Qualia are the texture of experience, the grain of reality as it appears from the inside. They are the reason you cannot fully know what it is like to be someone else, even if you knew everything about their brain. They are the reason Mary learns something new when she steps out of her black and white room. They are the reason a perfect zombie, if one could exist, would be missing something essential. And they are the reason the hard problem refuses to go away. You can deny qualia, redefine them, argue that they are illusions or confusions, but you cannot step outside the qualitative dimension of your own experience. You are always already within it, always feeling something, always having a perspective. That is the stubborn fact at the center of consciousness. That is what resists reduction. That is what keeps philosophers awake at night, wondering how mere matter could ever feel like this. One response to the hard problem is to reject the entire framing, to argue that consciousness is not a mystery but a confusion, and that what needs explaining are functions, not feelings. In the early 1960s, a new approach to the mind began to take shape, one that promised to sidestep the entire quagmire of consciousness by changing what needed explaining. This approach, called functionalism, proposed something radical. What makes a mental state the kind of state it is has nothing to do with what it is made of. A belief is not defined by neural firing patterns or immaterial soul stuff. A belief is defined by what it does, by its role in a system of causes and effects. The insight came from multiple directions at once. Hilary Putnam, working at MIT and later Harvard, drew inspiration from the new science of computing. A program could run on different hardware, vacuum tubes, transistors, silicon chips, and remain the same program. The software was independent of its physical implementation. Perhaps minds worked the same way. Perhaps pain was not identical to C fibers firing, but rather to whatever played the pain role caused by tissue damage, producing withdrawal behavior, prompting the desire to make it stop. The physical substrate could vary. What mattered was the functional architecture. This was philosophically elegant and scientifically promising. It meant that minds could be studied without waiting for neuroscience to map every synapse. It meant that artificial intelligence was not a category mistake, but a genuine possibility. Silicon could think if it instantiated the right functions. It meant that mental states were multiply realizable, human brains, octopus brains, future robots, perhaps even alien civilizations with biochemistry, utterly unlike ours, all could share mental states by sharing functional organization. Functionalism swept through philosophy of mind in the 1970s and 80s, becoming something close to orthodoxy. It unified the field with cognitive science, promised compatibility with materialism without crude reductionism, and offered a research program that seemed both rigorous and tractable. Mental states were causal roles. To explain pain was to explain its position in the web of causes and effects. Nothing more was needed. But there was a problem. Actually, there was the problem. Functionalism explained behavior beautifully. It explained how information flowed through a system, how inputs were processed into outputs, how beliefs and desires interacted to produce action. What it did not explain, what it did not even attempt to explain, was why any of this felt like anything. The issue surfaced most clearly in a thought experiment posed by Ned Block in 1978. Imagine the entire population of China, roughly 1 billion people at the time, organized into a vast network that mirrored the functional organization of a human brain. Each person plays the role of a single neuron, connected by radio links, receiving inputs and producing outputs according to specified rules. The system has all the right functional properties. It processes information exactly as a conscious brain does. According to functionalism, this nation of China brain should be conscious. It should have beliefs, desires, sensations. It should feel pain when damaged and pleasure when goals are achieved. But does it? Can we really believe that this distributed bureaucracy, spread across a continent, coordinating through walkie-talkies, somehow gives rise to a unified conscious experience? Where would that experience be located? Who would be having it? The thought seems absurd. Yet functionalism offers no principled reason to deny consciousness to the system. It has the right functions. That is supposed to be enough. The problem cuts deeper still. Even setting aside outlandish examples, functionalism seems to describe minds from the outside only. It tells us what pain does, how it affects behavior, how it relates to other mental states, how it prompts avoidance learning, but it never touches what pain is like, the raw, unpleasant, distinctly painful quality of the experience itself. Function specifies role. Consciousness is not a role. It is a presence, an interiority, a dimension of reality that seems to exceed any description of what it accomplishes. Enter Daniel Dennett, who has spent 4 decades arguing that this entire worry rests on a confusion. In 1991, he published Consciousness Explained, a book whose very title was a provocation. Many philosophers immediately dubbed it Consciousness Ignored or Consciousness Explained Away. But Dennett's point was serious and sustained. The hard problem is not hard because it points to a deep mystery. It is hard because it is based on bad intuitions about what consciousness is. Dennett's central move is to reject the notion of qualia, those supposedly private, ineffable, intrinsic qualities of experience. He argues that when we introspect carefully, what we actually find are judgments, dispositions, reactive tendencies, all perfectly explainable in functional and physical terms. The seeming gulf between third-person description and first-person experience is an artifact of bad theorizing, not a feature of reality. Consider his analogy of stage magic. A skilled magician makes you absolutely convinced that a woman has been sawed in half. Your experience is vivid, immediate, undeniable. But if you then insist that philosophy must explain how the woman was really sawed in half and reassembled, you are asking the wrong question. The trick is not what it seems. The same, Dennett argues, applies to consciousness. We are convinced that there is something irreducibly subjective, some inner glow of awareness that transcends function. But that conviction is itself part of the phenomenon to be explained, not an untouchable datum that constrains explanation. For Dennett, the task is to show how brains create the illusion of Cartesian theatres, private screening rooms where experiences are presented to an inner observer. Once you dismantle that false model, once you replace it with multiple drafts of information processing, pandemonium architectures, fame in the brain, then the hard problem dissolves. There is no residual mystery of why information processing feels like something, because feeling like something was never a separate fact to begin with. This position has made Dennett either a hero or a villain, depending on perspective. His opponents accuse him of changing the subject, of explaining everything about consciousness except consciousness itself. Dennett replies that this objection simply begs the question, assuming the very thing that needs to be proven, that there is a further fact of consciousness beyond functional organization and physical process. The debate reveals a fundamental divide in philosophy of mind. On one side stand philosophers like Chalmers, Nagel, and Jackson, who insist that subjective experience is explanatorily and metaphysically distinct from any amount of functional or physical description. Even a complete functional account leaves the hardest question untouched. On the other side stand philosophers like Dennett and the Churchlands, who argue that this seeming gap is an illusion born of dualistic intuitions we should abandon. There is no explanatory gap, only an expectation gap, a mistaken expectation about what a successful explanation should look like. The split runs deep enough that the two camps sometimes seem to be discussing different phenomena altogether. One group points to the undeniable reality of experience and demands an account of its qualitative character. The other group warns against reifying folk categories and insists that scientific understanding will require abandoning pre-theoretical intuitions. One sees mystery, the other sees confusion. What makes the disagreement so intractable is that both sides can claim a kind of victory within their own terms. Functionalism succeeds brilliantly at explaining cognitive architecture, information processing, behavioral dispositions. It integrates seamlessly with neuroscience and artificial intelligence. If that is what explaining the mind means, then mission accomplished. But if explaining the mind means accounting for why there is something it is like to undergo these processes, then functionalism has not even begun. It describes the mechanism while remaining silent on the phenomenon the mechanism supposedly produces. Perhaps the most striking feature of functionalism is not that it denies consciousness, but that it renders the question of consciousness strangely optional. The functional story is complete on its own terms. You can describe every causal role, every information flow, every behavioral output, without ever mentioning subjective experience. Consciousness becomes, in a sense, epiphenomenal to the explanation, not in the sense that it has no effects, but in the sense that its presence or absence makes no difference to the functional account. This is why zombies haunt functionalism so persistently. A perfect functional duplicate of you would behave exactly as you do, process information exactly as you do, report experiences exactly as you do. Functionalism has no tools to distinguish between that zombie and a genuinely conscious being. The function is the same. The role is the same. Yet one scenario includes consciousness and the other does not. Either that difference is real and important, in which case functionalism misses something essential, or the difference is illusory and confused, in which case the hard problem evaporates. The debate remains unresolved because it hinges on whether subjective experience is a genuine explanandum or a conceptual artifact. And that question in turn depends on intuitions about explanation, reduction, and the relationship between first-person and third-person perspectives, intuitions that show no sign of converging. If neither dualism nor physicalism nor functionalism can solve the problem, some philosophers have turned to more radical options. Perhaps consciousness is not produced by matter, but woven into it. When every conventional solution to a philosophical problem fails, when dualism collapses into paradox and physicalism leaves experience unexplained and functionalism seems to miss the point entirely, the mind turns toward options that once seemed absurd. Panpsychism is one of those options. It proposes something that sounds at first like mysticism or poetry rather than philosophy, that consciousness is not produced by certain complex arrangements of matter, but is instead a fundamental feature of matter itself. Every particle, every atom, every electron possesses some primitive form of experience. The universe is not divided into the conscious and the non-conscious. It is conscious all the way down. This is not a new idea. It appears in various forms across cultures and centuries, from ancient Greek philosophy to Spinoza to Leibniz to Whitehead. But in recent decades, as the hard problem has proven resistant to every standard approach, panpsychism has returned to serious philosophical discussion, not as fringe speculation, but as a live hypothesis debated in academic journals and conference halls. The question is no longer whether panpsychism is strange. The question is whether it might actually be less strange than the alternatives. The motivation for panpsychism emerges directly from the failures of physicalism. If you start with matter that has no trace of consciousness whatsoever, no glimmer of interiority, no hint of what it is like to be that thing, then how does consciousness ever arise? You can add complexity. You can arrange neurons into networks, networks into systems, systems into brains. But if the basic ingredients are entirely experienceless, then no amount of arrangement seems capable of producing experience. You cannot get something from nothing. This is the emergence problem, and it haunts every attempt to explain consciousness as arising from the purely physical. Panpsychism offers a different picture. If the basic elements of reality already possess some minimal form of consciousness, some proto-experiential quality, then human consciousness is not a miraculous leap from nothing but a matter of combination and organization. The feeling of being you is built up from countless tiny feelings, the way a building is built from bricks or a wave from water molecules. Consciousness does not emerge ex nihilo. It is already there in the foundations, waiting to be structured into the rich inner life you know. This solves one problem, but immediately creates another. If electrons and quarks have experiences, how do those micro-experiences combine into the unified stream of consciousness you inhabit? This is called the combination problem, and it is panpsychism's greatest challenge. Your consciousness feels like a single unified thing. When you look at a sunset, you do not experience separate sensations of orange and pink and purple and cloud and horizon, all happening independently. You experience one coherent scene, one moment, one you witnessing it all. But if your brain is made of billions of particles, each with its own micro-experience, why do you not have billions of separate experiences instead of one unified consciousness? The panpsychist must explain how many small subjects combine into one large subject, and this is not at all obvious. In fact, it seems deeply mysterious. When you combine two physical things, you get a bigger physical thing with predictable properties. When you combine two water molecules, you get more water behaving as water does. But when you combine two subjects of experience, what exactly do you get? Does the electron's experience somehow blend with the quark's experience? Do they vote? Do they merge? Do they elect a spokesperson consciousness that gets to feel everything while the others go dormant? Every answer seems either arbitrary or incoherent. Some panpsychists bite the bullet and accept that the combination problem may be unsolvable within our current concepts. Perhaps we simply lack the conceptual framework to understand how micro-experiences relate to macro-experiences, the way a medieval philosopher lacked the concepts to understand quantum mechanics. Others propose specific mechanisms, resonance theories, integrated information approaches, mathematical structures that might unify distributed experiences into wholes, but none of these proposals has achieved anything close to consensus. The combination problem remains panpsychism's Achilles heel. Still, panpsychists argue that their problem is no worse than the emergence problem facing physicalists. At least panpsychism starts with consciousness in the ingredients. Physicalism starts with ingredients that seem entirely wrong for producing consciousness, and then asks you to believe it happens anyway, given enough complexity, which is the bigger mystery, how small experiences combine into large ones, or how no experience becomes any experience at all. Panpsychism is not the only radical solution. Neutral monism, a view with roots in the work of Bertrand Russell and William James, suggests that mind and matter are not two separate kinds of substance, but two different ways of organizing or perceiving a single underlying reality that is itself neither mental nor physical. Consciousness and physical processes are like two sides of a coin, two aspects of something deeper that we have no direct access to. This dissolves the hard problem by rejecting its premise. There is no gap to bridge because there was never a real separation in the first place. Idealism takes the opposite approach from physicalism. Instead of reducing mind to matter, it reduces matter to mind. The physical world in this view is itself a construct of consciousness, a pattern of experiences rather than an independent reality that produces experiences. George Berkeley argued this position in the 18th century, claiming that to be is to be perceived. The tree in the forest makes no sound when no one hears it, because sound is an experience, and without consciousness there is no experience. Modern versions of idealism are more sophisticated, but they share the core intuition. Consciousness is not the latecomer in the story of the universe. It is the stage on which the story unfolds. Then there is Mysterianism, which is less a solution than a principled surrender. Colin McGinn and others have argued that human cognitive architecture may simply be incapable of understanding consciousness. Just as a dog cannot grasp calculus, we may lack the mental capacity to understand how brains produce awareness. The hard problem is not hard because we have not been clever enough. It is hard because it lies beyond the reach of human cognition. We are cognitively closed to the answer. This is not defeatism so much as intellectual humility, an acknowledgement that our minds, however impressive, have limits. Each of these radical views remains a minority position in philosophy of mind. Physicalism, despite its troubles, still commands the largest following, perhaps because it promises unity with science, or perhaps because the alternatives seem even more difficult to stomach. Panpsychism strikes many philosophers as too strange, too untethered from empirical investigation, too willing to populate the universe with invisible experiences. Neutral monism and idealism seem to multiply mysteries rather than solve them. Mysterianism feels like giving up. But these views refuse to disappear. They persist in the literature, attract serious defenders, generate new papers and books and conferences. They persist because the hard problem itself persists. and because every orthodox solution has failed to satisfy, they persist because they capture something that feels true to the phenomenology of consciousness, the sense that experience is not a secondary feature of reality, but something fundamental, something woven into the fabric of what is. The debate over panpsychism and its cousins reveals something important about the hard problem. After decades of rigorous argument, brilliant thought experiments, and careful conceptual analysis, the field has not converged on an answer. Instead, it has clarified the costs and consequences of each possible answer. We now understand what you must believe if you accept physicalism, and what problems you must solve if you accept panpsychism, and what you must give up if you accept Mysterianism. The menu of options is clearer, but the choice remains open. Perhaps that is because the hard problem touches on questions that philosophy alone cannot answer. Or perhaps it is because the problem is formulated in terms that already presuppose a division between matter and mind, between objective and subjective, between the explainable and the felt. That is itself the source of the confusion. Or perhaps consciousness really is the mystery it seems to be, the thing that makes you irreducible and inexplicable, the light inside that illuminates everything else but cannot see its own source. After decades of debate, the hard problem remains unsolved, but what has changed is our understanding of what is at stake and what it would mean to truly solve it. More than 30 years have passed since David Chalmers stood in Tucson and named the hard problem. In that time, thousands of papers have been written, dozens of conferences convened, entire research programs launched. Neuroscience has mapped the brain with ever greater precision. Philosophers have refined their arguments, sharpened their thought experiments, built elaborate theories of consciousness, and yet no consensus has emerged. The hard problem remains exactly that, hard. This persistence is itself revealing. Philosophy has solved problems before, or at least moved past them. Debates that once consumed generations can come to seem quaint. Their urgency faded, but the hard problem does not fade. If anything, it has deepened. The more we learn about the brain, the more mysterious consciousness becomes. Every advance in neuroscience seems to push the explanatory gap further open rather than close it. Part of the difficulty lies in the nature of the problem itself. Most philosophical disputes involve disagreements about interpretation, about which framework best explains a shared set of facts. But the hard problem involves a disagreement about what the facts are. Those who think consciousness poses a unique explanatory challenge, and those who think it does not, are speaking different languages. They look at the same data and see different things. One side sees an unbridgeable gap between neural firing and felt experience. The other sees only a failure to appreciate how explanation works. This is why Daniel Dennett and David Chalmers can debate for decades without either changing his mind. They do not disagree about evidence. They disagree about what counts as evidence, what counts as explanation, what counts as understanding. Dennett thinks the hard problem is a confusion generated by bad intuitions about consciousness. Chalmers thinks the intuitions are tracking something real that functionalism cannot capture. No amount of neuroscience can adjudicate this dispute, because the dispute is about what neuroscience is capable of explaining. Perhaps the hard problem is not solvable within the conceptual resources we currently possess. Thomas Nagel suggested this possibility in the 1970s. He argued that our concepts of mental and physical are too crude, too tied to our particular perspective. To bridge the gap, we need not a better theory within the existing framework, but a new framework altogether, one that dissolves the mind-body problem by reconfiguring our understanding of both mind and body. But what would such a framework look like? Nagel could not say, and no one since has managed to articulate it. Colin McGinn went further. In a 1989 paper, he proposed that human beings might be cognitively closed to the solution. Just as a dog cannot understand quantum mechanics, we might lack the conceptual apparatus to understand how physical processes give rise to consciousness. The solution exists, but it lies forever beyond our reach. This view, called Mysterianism, is both humble and deeply unsatisfying. It acknowledges our limits while declaring those limits insurmountable. Yet even if the hard problem cannot be solved, the debate surrounding it has not been fruitless. Decades of rigorous argument, have clarified what is at stake. The structure of the problem is now mapped with precision. Philosophers know exactly where the fault lines lie, which intuitions support, which theories, what the costs and benefits of each position are. This is progress, even if it is not solution. The debate has also revealed something about the nature of explanation itself. When we explain something scientifically, we typically show how it arises from simpler components according to general laws. We explain water by reference to hydrogen and oxygen. We explain digestion by reference to enzymes and chemical reactions. But consciousness seems to resist this kind of explanation. Knowing every detail about neurons and synapses does not obviously tell us why there is something it is like to undergo those processes. Either our notion of explanation is too narrow, or consciousness is genuinely unlike other phenomena. This has implications for the boundaries of science. Science has been spectacularly successful at explaining the objective world, the world of things that can be measured and observed from the outside. But consciousness is not just an object in the world. It is the subjective perspective from which the world is observed. To study consciousness scientifically, we must objectify it, turn it into something measurable. But in doing so, we may lose precisely what we are trying to explain, the first-person character of experience. Some philosophers argue this shows that science cannot be the whole story. There are truths about consciousness, facts about what it is like to be you, that cannot be captured in the language of physics or neuroscience. Others argue that this conclusion is too quick, that we simply need better science or a better understanding of how scientific explanation works. The debate continues. What is striking is how existential this question is. Consciousness is not some distant phenomenon we can study dispassionately. It is the condition of our knowing anything at all. Every fact you know, every argument you follow, every sensation you feel is given to you in and through consciousness. To ask how consciousness arises from matter is to ask how the ground of all your experience is itself grounded. This creates a peculiar circularity to investigate consciousness. You use consciousness to theorize about experience. You rely on experience. The investigator and the investigated are not separate. You cannot step outside your own mind to examine it from a neutral vantage. This is what makes consciousness uniquely difficult. Every other object of study can be held at a distance, observed from multiple perspectives, measured with instruments, but consciousness cannot be observed except from within. For some, this circularity suggests that the hard problem is unsolvable in principle. The tools we use to investigate the world are tools of consciousness, and they may not be capable of explaining their own operation. For others, the circularity is not a barrier but a clue. Perhaps understanding consciousness requires a different kind of inquiry, one that takes the first-person perspective seriously rather than trying to eliminate it. Beyond the academy, the hard problem matters because it touches the deepest questions of human existence. If consciousness cannot be explained by physical processes, then you are not simply your body. Some part of your inner life escapes the causal net of physics. This does not prove dualism or the existence of a soul, but it does suggest that the materialist picture of the world is incomplete. There is something about being you that eludes purely physical description. On the other hand, if consciousness can be explained physically, then the felt texture of your experience is not a brute fact, but something that arose through natural processes. Your joys and sorrows, your loves and fears, are patterns in neural activity, exquisitely complex, but ultimately reducible to matter in motion. This is either a terrible diminishment or a profound integration, depending on how you look at it. Either way, the hard problem forces us to confront what we are, a self in a physical world, a subject of experience embedded in a universe of objects, the one thing you know most intimately and yet cannot explain. The hard problem is not just a puzzle for philosophers, it is the puzzle of being you.